Right, so let's unpack this. We are diving into one of the most significant legal battles of the last decade. The Supreme Court's rulings in Students for Fair Admissions v. Harvard and UNC. And this isn't just about college admissions. It's really a fundamental conflict over what equality even means in America today.
It really is.
Our sources for this deep dive are the actual opinions themselves. We have Chief Justice Roberts' majority, the very sharp concurrences from Justices Thomas, Gorsuch, and Kavanaugh, and then on the other side, these incredibly forceful dissents from Justices Sotomayor and Jackson.
And our mission really is to distill these core, almost irreconcilable legal and philosophical visions that they all lay out.
Irreconcilable is a good word for it.
It is, and that distillation is so vital because the ground has just shifted dramatically. I mean, this ruling immediately invalidated the admissions programs at Harvard and UNC. It ended a half-century of precedent.
Right.
But if you actually read the pages, you see the real argument is about the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. It's about whether it demands, total colorblindness today or if it still permits measures to overcome the systemic effects of past discrimination.
So let's start with that majority opinion from Roberts. To understand why the court struck these programs down, we have to start with the legal test they used.
And that's strict scrutiny.
Strict scrutiny. It sounds like something you'd want to avoid at all costs. What does it actually demand?
Well, it demands two things, and the court almost never finds that they're met. First, the government, so in this case the university, has to show a compelling governmental interest.
Okay.
And second, the way they try to achieve that interest has to be narrowly tailored, meaning it's absolutely necessary, the least restrictive way to get it done. The court just flat out said that distinctions based on ancestry are odious to a free people. So any race-based action is immediately suspect.
And Chief Justice Roberts, writing for the majority, said the universities failed on three key areas of precedent that used to define what was okay?
Exactly. The first failure was a lack of measurable objectives. The universities talked about these lofty diversity goals, like training students to live together in a diverse society.
I mean, how do you even measure that? How do you know if a student has been successfully trained to live in a diverse society? It sounds like an aspiration, not a legal standard.
That is precisely the majority's point. They argued the goals were just too vague for any kind of meaningful judicial review. And Justice Thomas, in his concurrence, he really chimed in on this. He called that goal a worthy social aspiration, but said it's fundamentally not an educational interest that justifies using race. If the goal is unmeasurable, how could a court ever know if it's worked, or, more importantly, when it needs to end?
And that connects right into the second failure he pointed to, the unavoidable negative factor.
The zero-sum game.
Yeah, the zero-sum game. The idea that if you give a benefit to one applicant based on race, you're, by definition, taking an opportunity away from someone else.
That's right. And the fact that the First Circuit Court found Harvard's policy did result in fewer admissions for Asian American students, well, that just underscored the point for the majority.
So the idea that race could just be a plus factor without ever being a minus factor was, just illogical to them?
Completely illogical in a world with limited seats. You can't avoid the reality that an advantage for one group means a disadvantage for another in this kind of competitive environment.
And then the third failure Roberts highlighted was stereotyping and this lack of a logical endpoint.
Yes, the programs were criticized for basically tolerating stereotyping. They relied on this idea that a black student, just by being black, automatically brings some unique perspective that a white student can't.
Which the court saw as judging people by ancestry, not individual merit.
Exactly, a violation of the Equal Protection Clause. And then there was the endpoint problem. The old precedent, Grutter, suggested these policies should end in 25 years. We were coming up on that 2028 date, but the universities had no plan to stop. That proved to the majority there was no end in sight.
Okay, that's a pretty comprehensive takedown. But here's the crucial caveat. The thing every high school student and parent really needs to understand now. What can schools still do? What about, say, the college essay?
So the majority made a very explicit carve-out here. They said nothing prohibits universities from considering an applicant's discussion of how race affected their life.
But there's a catch.
There is a catch. That discussion has to be tied to a quality of character, a specific experience, or a unique ability that that particular applicant can contribute.
So if I'm a student, I can't write, "Admit me because my race helps diversity." But I can write, "Growing up as a first-generation student in a segregated community, I worked 2 jobs, and that taught me resilience and leadership, which I can bring to your campus." Is that the line?
That is the crucial distinction. The focus has to be on the individual's journey and how it shaped them, their character, their skills, their perspective. The court drew a hard line at using race as a category or a proxy for experience itself. The individual story is what matters, not the demographic box.
Okay, so let's move into the concurrences. Because here we see the conservative justices all agree on the outcome, but they get there from vastly different philosophical places. Justice Thomas starts with this deep, uncompromising stand on constitutional history.
What's fascinating here is Thomas's commitment to what he calls an absolute colorblind constitution. I mean, he spends a huge part of his opinion arguing that the 14th Amendment, from the very beginning, established the principle of absolute equality of all citizens.
He's basically resurrecting Justice Harlan's famous dissent in Plessy v. Ferguson, the whole "our Constitution is colorblind" idea.
Exactly. He's saying that is the original intended meaning. And he uses that to just demolish what's called the anti-subordination view, this idea that the amendment only forbids laws that hurt black citizens, but allows laws that are meant to help them.
But doesn't that immediately run into a historical snag? I mean, the dissent argues that the very same people who wrote the 14th Amendment also passed race-conscious laws like the Freedmen's Bureau Act. How does he square that?
He doesn't really. And that sets up this huge historical friction with the dissenters. Thomas's counter-argument is that those Reconstruction-era laws were, very narrow exceptions. They were temporary relief for newly freed slaves after a war. They weren't meant to establish a general principle of race-conscious government. For him, two discriminatory wrongs just can't make a right.
And Thomas also goes into the real-world harm he sees in these policies.
Yes. He focuses heavily on this concept of mismatch. He cites research suggesting that when you place students in schools that are far more competitive than where they would have otherwise attended, they often suffer academically.
Poor grades, higher dropout rates.
Especially in fields like STEM. And on top of that, he argues these policies stigmatize all successful minority students. It creates this cloud of suspicion that their achievements weren't earned solely on merit.
Okay, now here's where it gets really interesting. We shift from constitutional history with Thomas to pure statutory text with Justice Gorsuch. He barely even mentions the 14th Amendment. He's all about the Civil Rights Act of 1964.
Gorsuch is the textualist here. Title VI of that act says, "No person shall, on the ground of race, be excluded from or discriminated against under any program that gets federal money." He says that language is a categorical, strict rule. It doesn't matter if your intentions are good.
So he's saying that even if affirmative action were somehow constitutional, it's explicitly forbidden by the statute. That's a huge legal move.
It is. He leans heavily on the Bostock precedent, and he insists Title VI prohibits treating a person worse because of their race. He uses a but-for causation standard. If an applicant's race was the but-for reason they were denied or admitted, it violates the statute. End of story. For him, this statute has independent force.
And he also had some pretty sharp words for the government's racial classifications themselves.
Oh, yeah. He called them incoherent and bureaucratic. He noted how you have these vast populations all grouped under one umbrella term, like Asian, which includes everyone from Chinese to Filipino to Indian people.
Groups with wildly different experiences and outcomes.
Wildly different.
Yeah.
And he argued the government is just paving over countless differences to maintain a system that is, in his view, inherently illegal under Title VI.
This brings us to the powerful dissents from Justices Sotomayor and Jackson, and they offer a completely different constitutional vision, one that stresses history, context, and the persistent reality of racial inequality today.
Justice Sotomayor's argument is that the whole goal of the 14th Amendment was never formalistic race blindness. It was to achieve racial equality of opportunity.
And she's arguing that demanding passive neutrality today is just not enough when segregation and historical inequality are still so present.
Right, and she uses the history of the Reconstruction era to directly contradict Justice Thomas. She points to things like the Freedmen's Bureau Act, which provided specific aid, land, and funding explicitly targeted to formerly enslaved Black Americans.
Including establishing historically Black colleges and universities.
Exactly. She's saying, look, if the people who wrote the Equal Protection Clause were doing this, then they clearly permitted considering race to achieve actual equality.
Her dissent reads almost like a catalog of current stark inequality.
It is a devastating summary. She notes that 80% of predominantly Black and Latino schools have 75% or more students eligible for reduced lunch. She highlights that Black home ownership still trails white home ownership by 25 percentage points.
Her conclusion is pretty stark.
It is. She says, ignoring race will not equalize a society that is racially unequal. She essentially argues that the court is choosing to stick its head in the sand.
And Justice Jackson just hammers this point home by focusing on the active role government policy played in creating these gaps, what she calls the intergenerational transmission of inequality.
Her most illustrative tool was that hypothetical of John, the seventh-generation white UNC applicant, and James, the first-generation black UNC applicant. She meticulously detailed how government policies, like the FHA underwriting segregated suburbs and racially restricted GI Gold benefits, built massive wealth for white families while explicitly excluding black families.
So her argument is that the government spent decades creating preferences for John's family, and now the court is demanding that colleges ignore the massive resulting gap for James's family.
Precisely. She argues this gap isn't some private misfortune. It's a direct result of government policy. So for her, forcing colleges to ignore that race-linked gap will inevitably widen that gap, not narrow it. It's an argument for substantive equality. Equality in real-world outcomes, not just formal equality in the words of the law.
And she also introduced a really compelling argument about the stakes, suggesting diversity literally saves lives.
She did. She cited studies showing that black physicians are more likely to accurately assess black patients' pain, and that having a black physician more than doubles the chances a high-risk black newborn will survive. She's framing diversity not as some political ideal, but as an effort to secure a more functional society with better outcomes for everyone.
So this deep dive really reveals two fundamentally different constitutional blueprints. On one side, you have Roberts, Thomas Gorsuch, rooted in absolute colorblindness, demanding formal neutrality today, no matter what happened in the past.
And on the other, Sotomayor and Jackson, who demand that you acknowledge that history. They argue the 14th Amendment requires active measures to achieve real equality, because the current systems just perpetuate old harms.
The core tension, it seems, revolves around judicial deference. Who gets to define what a compelling interest is?
That's right. The majority ultimately said they would not defer to the university's vague goals of diversity. They insisted that defining the constitutional limits of racial classification belongs to the court, not to a university.
So the decision really forces us to grapple with a question that is far from settled. Can you truly achieve equality by ignoring the history that created inequality in the first place?
Or does ignoring the effects of that history simply lock in the status quo? That's the question left hanging.
And here is a final provocative thought for you to consider, building on this tension we just discussed. The court made an explicit, very narrow exception for military academies in its ruling. It said the interest in preparing diverse officers for a diverse fighting force remains a potentially distinct interest that could justify considering race. So think about this. If diversity is potentially constitutional when it serves national security, when it helps the military function in a diverse world, does that suggest that diversity is only compelling when it serves the defense of the nation, but not when it seeks to build a stronger civil society or a more representative economy or a better healthcare system? That's something worth mulling over.